Devolve. Devolve. Dear Fundis, who went out of their communities, their countries, and their cocoons in search of better education, degrees, masters, and PhDs. Dear activists here present, whose activism is catalyzed from outside their countries, outside their communities and cocoons. Dear us all who so wish to be crocodiles at home and lizards outside. Dear citizens, all of us whose lives are run in Harare. Let me say, the time has finally come, the time to devolve, and the gatekeepers are still keeping the gates closed. And I wonder what 2023 processes will have as the output for those who will be able to lubricate and propel the engines of devolution. It was Jesus Christ, the Messiah, and Barabbas, the barbarians. And the tens of thousands of people were there, pumping Pilate to vote between the two. Jesus had given the blind their eyes, the deaf their ears, those who were dumb their voices, the lepers their skins, even the dead life in his fullness. But the people in their thousands voted for his crucifixion and death. But for Barabbas, the barbarian, the most violent person on land that time, who had killed people, maimed and violated people's rights, the people in their thousands and thousands voted for his freedom and more life in his fullness. Then the question comes, I wonder why the good ones who propel the goodwill of the people never live to see the light of the day. I believe the processes to come will have the minds and hearts that will propel. From the Oxford Dictionary of Contemporary English, devolution is described as a sweetheart, as a darling for the Zimbabwean masses. Let me say, ukwehlisela amandla ezabelweni iziqinti ngeziqinti, and the Zimbabweans are anxiously waiting for that majestic pride, umakoti, devolution. The transfer of power and funding from the national and local to the local government, where decisions are made to the local people, closer to them, closer to the businesses of that place, closer to them, closer to the citizens. Yes, dear devolution, our sweetheart, our darling, Babes Watumo, Uzofa, wafika na makoti wabokhokho bethu, amandla ebantwini, umnotho ezandleni zabantu, bantu abahle, mahlabezulu, mthwakazi kandaba, manene lamanenekazi, gentlemen and gentle ladies. Let me say, devolution is possible. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Umpulu makasana agayehle enzombeni kabuhlalise benkosi. Usuku zukuduma impela ngithi kuye akakhululeke aphuke adobhe impobo aqunta impobo ezabelweni zakibo eziqintini zakibo. Hathi ukuthunjwa ahugwe arojwe. Devolution is imminent. Chapter 14 of the new constitution provides for a devolved state. Ayesaba magola njalo engqikaza kodwa izembe selibekiwe, it has been cast. Ngithi kini section 264 is clearer and more clearer to devolve self-governance fever. Self-determination by the people in their thousands in this country. Yes, it is there. And I say in their respective local authorities, it is unstoppable. Devolution is an idea whose time has finally come. Devolve, evolve, man, involve, develop, and prosper as the Zimbabwe community. Welcome to the Stakeholder Consultative Symposium on the Devolution Public Finance Management Framework. Bosongondo, Danke Subst, Danke Simcot, Danke PPRIZ. The time has finally come. Danke stakeholders. Fuga section 301. 3. Vuga. Since 2019, the central government, Ubamba Zonke, through the finance ministry, has been honoring this constitutional obligation. But there is a problem of problems. Allocating provinces and local authorities in Mali, the funding. But all of this has been good. All of this good has been done without the proper enabling legislation. No enabling legislation. Indeed, there is no sound public policy management framework. We are here to propel the engines of thoughts. Together, let's develop a consolidated civic society position paper on the best practices in the meaningful way to manage the public resources in a developed state. This will boost the level of transparency and accountability with regard to the utilization of the devolution funds across all local authorities. No gold mafia must poke his nose on the people's funds. Timber in Lupane for the Lupanians. Coal in Wange for those in Wange. Amatrimbe Kwanda for the Amachaunda. The time to devolve is now. The Oxford Dictionary of Contemporary English says, thank you is the most used word on earth. Let me hasten to say, thank you. I wish you a successful deliberation so that we devolve and devolve forever. Amen.
Levugile, good morning, Mamkase. I've been given one of the most difficult tasks to set the tone for the symposium. I think as the first speaker, I've been given the responsibilities to try and unpack what devolution is from a policy and legal perspective. I think from the introductions that we had, quite a number of issues were touched on what really needs to be included when we look at the concept and the aspect of devolution. So I'll try to delve into this issue by unpacking some of the policy and also legal perspectives. I think one of the key and central issues that we need to look at is what is devolution. I think we've heard from others, I think even from our previous act, where devolution involves the delegation of powers from central government to regional or local administrations. And in the context of Zimbabwe, we are talking about the delegation of these powers to provincial, metropolitan, and also local authorities. As you can see from the right side of the presentation slide, I think we've evolved over the years as a country in terms of the operations of the local governance sphere when we look at urban councils and also rural district councils. I think from 1980 up until 2013, we have had to contend with issues of decentralization, which is quite prominent and common at the present moment, where we look at how decentralization brought about the idea of VITCOs, WATCOs, and also district councils and how they were elevated in terms of the structure of the hierarchy to provincial and national level. But in 2013, I think this is where discussions of devolution started. If you remember the constitution making process from 2010 to around 2013, in one of the key issues that really was a stumbling block was the issue of devolution. How can we decentralize power? But if you remember quite well, there were 3 provinces that were behind this key issue. And these included Matabele North, Mat South, you've got your Blawa and also Midlands. The reason why these provinces were pushed to look at the issue of devolution was because of the continuous marginalization that was taking place. And so because of these ideas, this is where, when we look at devolution, one of the people that I was discussing with was said, no, for us devolution means that public services can no longer be only found in Harare, but we can also be able to access public services, even in our own vicinities. So that is how some people understand devolution, but this is the simplest definition. But however, we also need to contextualize and look at what does devolution mean in the context of Zimbabwe. I think I've highlighted already that the 2013 constitution is the one that really paved the way for devolution to become a prominent concept and also try to guide us in terms of how power can be decentralized. And Section 264 of the Constitution is the one that provides devolution in terms of how powers and responsibilities are also supposed to be devolved to structures such as your provincial or metropolitan councils and also even local authorities. But however, when we also look at devolution, I would like to emphasize this. In the context of Zimbabwe, devolution seems to be more biased on economic power more than political power. So we see that the central government still wants to maintain that unitary state structure. And for it to do that, it has one way or the other, the process of devolving power has to be involved. But however, it seems like in our context, it has to do more with economic power. This is how it also aligns to the topic of discussion for today when we want to look at devolution and also the public finance management framework. The devolution contained in Section 264 of the Constitution also explains some of the objectives that we have when it comes to understanding devolution and also its objectives. The first one is that there is a need to give power to local governance in terms of the people and also enhance their participation in the exercise of the powers of the state. And the second objective talks about promoting democratic, effective transparency, accountable and also coherent government in Zimbabwe as a whole. And then the third one, to preserve and foster the peace, national unity, and indivisibility of Zimbabwe. The other objectives looks at recognizing the right of communities to manage their own affairs and to further their development. I think this has also become a prominent objective, given that some of the speakers, when they're introducing themselves, they're talking about citizen participation. They're also talking about the voices of local communities being heard in the process of their own development. And also another aspect, there is also the need to ensure the equitable sharing of local and national resources. I think Desire raised a crucial point on what happened to the timber that is owned by communities in Lupani. So this is also another crucial objective that is contained in the devolution process in Zimbabwe. And then the last one, to transfer responsibilities and resources from the national government in order to establish a sound financial base. And I think this is the key objective that has gathered us here today, to try and look at the public finance management aspect. What framework do we have in place in terms of trying to manage our resources when it comes to devolution? When we look at the legal perspectives when it comes to devolution in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean Constitution of 2013 is the one that propelled the idea of devolution. And subsection 1 provides for devolution of governmental powers. I think I've already alluded to that. And then section 301.3 of the Constitution provides that a budget of at least 5% of the national revenues raised in any financial year should be allocated to the provinces and the local authorities. But however, my task is just to unpack. I think other colleagues are going to talk about some of the successes and the challenges when it comes to these provisions that are contained in the devolution process in Zimbabwe. But however, from a legal perspective, there's a need that at least 5% of the national budget is allocated to the devolution process. I think we've already heard of how some devolution funds are now being given out to local authorities in the form of our urban councils and also rural councils to be geared towards implementing development projects. Again, when we also look at Chapter 14 of the 2013 Constitution, I think this is the only chapter of the Constitution that has a preamble with relation to the provincial and also the local government structures. So when we look at this preamble, the first aspect is that there is a need for the preservation of national unity in Zimbabwe and the prevention of all forms of disunity and secession. If you remember in the past, I think we had Mtwara's Liberation Front, especially in the context of this region, leading the idea that should we have devolution or should we completely have cessation? But however, when we look at cessation, some scholars, when we read around, it's the reason why our devolution process became so confused was that there was the mixing of different ideas One, there was devolution that could not be understood clearly. There was also, again, the coming in of concepts such as decentralization. There was also, again, the aspect of federalism and also the aspect of secession. So when we look at concepts like federalism, this is what operates in America in terms of its devolution structure. How each state is in charge of its own affairs in terms of the judiciary and also in terms of its own financial matters. So these are some of the concepts that have been confusing the whole aspect of devolution. What does devolution entail? But however, when we look at this particular preamble, it tries to address some of them, that there is no need to have these forms of disunity and secession. And then the second part talks about the democratic participation in government by all citizens and communities of Zimbabwe. When we look at the concept of devolution, it's supposed to promote the aspect of democracy. So that is one of the factors where it hinges on. And then the third aspect talks about the equitable allocation of natural resources and participation of local communities. So these are some of the legal perspectives when it comes to this particular concept of devolution. And then in terms of the institutional framework, it's also important to try and understand which institutions are actually involved in this process of devolution. And in Zimbabwe, this mainly involves a three-tier process of government, where we've got the central government, which is the main actor, and then we've got the provincial and metropolitan councils, and then we've also got our local authorities, as provided in Section 5 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. And then when we also look at Section 270, it requires metropolitan and councils to undertake socio-economic development for their respective provinces. I think it also cascades down when we now look at Section 274 and 275 of the Constitution, which are referring to local authorities and how they are supposed to represent and also manage the affairs of the people. So when we look at this three-tier of government, instead of looking at it as a level of administration, it's quite important when it's looked at as a tier of government. It's an extension of government. It's no longer a level of administration. This is quite important because it prevents the arbitrary abolition of these subnational governments, where they are now supposed to be prominent, they're supposed to be visible. And instead of just being levels of administration, they are now part and parcel of the governance sphere. Now, looking at the policy perspectives on devolution, I think as you also look to your right of the slide, the devolution and decentralization policy was launched in 2020 in Zimbabwe. And this policy, when it was introduced, it was supposed to overcome historical fragmentation of various policies and legislation. Although I believe there are still contestations on this second point, I think for those who are going to discuss the successes, the challenges, I think are also going to raise some issues on how there is no harmonization of legislation when it comes to the devolution process. But however, again, as a policy document, it clearly outlines the implementation framework, what is supposed to be done, the local government structures that are there, the devolved functions as well. Even citizen participation is also at the epicenter. It also looks at devolution and also Vision 2030. I think at the present moment we are guided by NDS1 as our policy that guides us as a country in terms of the development trajectory that we're supposed to take. It also covers financing resources, which is the main aspect or point that we are going to be delving in terms of this symposium. It also looks at the role, clarity, and also devolved service delivery, staffing for the devolved mandates, and also financial and administrative capacity, amongst other key variables. So that is what is contained in the devolution and decentralization policy of Zimbabwe. So when we look at the devolution, it's supposed to be a vehicle that really drives a lot of issues. I think in the previous, we've had these challenges. That is why in 2013, devolution started to become a prominent aspect, where there was the over-centralization of services, where the central government had too much power in terms of trying to deliver a lot of socio-economic development-related issues and also other issues that have to do with how our societies progress. So in terms of this over-centralized system of governance, devolution has eroded it away in terms of trying to promote ethos such as democracy and also promoting locally driven development, improving the delivery of public services, and also in terms of promoting national integration and peace as well. I think I've already alluded to the issue that provinces such as Material, Nikens and Manicaland have long been blamed for underdevelopment. And so when you look at the devolution issue, these are some of the provinces that are actually driving this agenda in order to try and at least find a solution in terms of how can they have a locally driven development agenda which will be able to try and also propel them in terms of finding that vantage point in terms of socio-economic development. And through devolution, there is also the need to ensure vertical and horizontal equitable distribution of natural resources. So these are some of the policy perspectives that we have when it comes to devolution. There is also the idea of autonomy in terms of being able to ensure that these devolved powers are done even administratively. Decisions are made administratively. So these are some of the autonomies that are involved in terms of these devolved units. I also felt compelled to try and draw some lessons from other countries who have done and undergone this process of devolution. But there are also clear lessons, quite 5 of them, in terms of what are some of the issues that we should also take into consideration as a country in terms of trying to implement this process of devolution. The reason I'm saying trying to implement is because there has been dissatisfaction on what has been done since 2013 in terms of promoting devolution. The first one is that there is a need for a clear division of functions between local and central government. That needs to be clear and cut. And then the second one, there is also a need for adequate human and financial resources. I think this is also quite pertinent as we have these discussions in the symposium. I think there are issues that are going to be raised around that. There is also a need for a strong legal framework and policy guidelines. And there's also need for citizen participation to foster transparency and accountability. These have resonated with some of the speakers when they were introducing themselves, that there's also a need for transparency and accountability to be visible. There's in terms of African on how devolution can be implemented, they include Kenya, they also include South Africa, which has done remarkable in terms of trying to have this devolution process. We've got Uganda, Nigeria, Eswatini as well, and then Zimbabwe is still in theory. So there is a need for us to move from this theoretical kind of approach. The reason why I'm saying in theory is because it is there on pen and paper, but in terms of the practical implementation, this is where we still have got challenges. And then in terms of the European countries, the United Kingdom is there. I think it has devolved its political power to some smaller nations such as Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. We've also got other European countries such as the Netherlands, Italy, France, Switzerland, Spain, and also Nordic countries like Denmark and Finland. And then in terms of North American countries, we've got the United States and Canada, and then other countries such as Australia have managed to at least come up with a comprehensive devolution process that enables grassroots communities to at least be able to be in ownership of their own development process. And then in terms of the key issues that I feel like maybe they need to be considered in terms of implementing the devolution process here in Zimbabwe, the first one is that there is a need for the enactment of devolution laws, which are quite clear and they define the jurisdictional scope of subnational governments. The second one, there is also a need for fiscal devolution, where there is need to ensure that the different dimensions of devolution are effective in the sense that there is no omitting or delays of fiscal devolution. In as much as we can talk about how devolution funds have cascaded down to local authorities, but there is still no clear-cut implementation strategy on how these are supposed to be taken about. There's also the need for the designing of accountability mechanisms, where there is need for transparency, accountability, and also some form of integrity there in terms of how some of these issues are taken into consideration in relation to devolution. There's also the need for regulation of intergovernmental relations, where there is need for clarity of the relationship between the center and the devolved structures. This is in the case of the central government vis-a-vis the provincial and metropolitan councils and also the local councils. There's also the need for capacity building and development, which is quite a daunting task given that there is a need for a clear-cut framework in terms of service delivery in our communities and also in our various geographical locations. There's also the need for the strengthening of local democracy in terms of how multi-level systems are supposed to also be strengthened on their local democracy in terms of their approaches. There's also the need for the establishment of scaffolding institutions that can be able to really try and maybe find the right process in terms of the architecture of government and how this process is supposed to be done. And then maybe another key issue is that there is also the need for the harmonization of legislation. How we can have maybe legislation that can be clear-cut in terms of how the government is supposed to have power. And also I think at the present moment, because of these various legislations that we have, the central government keeps on retaining its power despite the existence of this so-called devolution process in the context of Zimbabwe. These are some of the key issues that I felt like I needed to raise. I think other colleagues are going to also highlight some of the challenges and successes and also some of the financial obligations that we have under the devolution process. But however, in terms of introducing this subject matter, this is what I had prepared. Thank you so much.